What's going on, YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte. Today we're taking a look at the Buffalo Sabres. Pun intended here, I'm warning you now. A sluggish start for the Buffalo Slugs up there in Buffalo. This has been one of those things where for the Buffalo Sabres, this is kind of the status quo. But there's a different feel for it once again for the Buffalo Sabres. Listen, I know my Sabres fans out there, you guys are a passionate fan base. You guys show up for a team that really hasn't given you anything to believe in. We're going to talk about the ownership, the general manager situation, the coaching situation, the on-ice product, the attendance. We're going to be going over as much of that as we can here in today's video. For the Buffalo Sabres, it just seems like status quo, but for the worst of reasons. This is a Buffalo Sabres team that in the world of professional sports has the longest playoff drought. This is a team that has not shown much glimmer of hope. They've made some interesting moves over the last couple years. You look at the collateral damage that has happened with the Buffalo Sabres franchise over the last decade. You look at when they went for that, going back to the Buffalo Sabres years in the mid-2000s, right? When they bought all those players to try and go on playoff runs like Chris Drury, Danny Briere, all those guys, Jordan Leopold, all those guys. I could list off a dozen more. The Buffalo Sabres really did a lot of damage long-term from that. You look at some of the trades they've made even more recently since then. I mean, guys that have left the Buffalo Sabres and immediately found success. Robin Lehner going to the New York Islanders. Jack Eichel going to the Vegas Golden Knights. Ryan O'Reilly going to, where'd he go? St. Louis? He went to the St. Louis Blues. And you guys will list off a bunch of other Buffalo Sabres that left the team and found success elsewhere. But I think for this Buffalo Sabres team, yes, partially that damage from all those horrible trades that went wrong are affecting them, and the lack of being able to make good signings like signing Jeff Skinner and things like that definitely come back to bite you. But there's a point where you have to catch a couple of lucky breaks that happen to fall in your favor. And that just hasn't happened for the Buffalo Sabres. And there's a lot behind that. And we're going to discuss some of that here today. But when you look at the Buffalo Sabres record, 11, 13, and 4, 26 points. They find themselves 5th in the Atlantic Division. And I think a good barometer for this team is looking at the other teams around them. Now, I know this isn't what Buffalo Sabres fans want to hear. And a really good video, and I should probably do kind of my own take on this as well at some point, but the Hockey Guy has a really good video where he talked about the forever rebuilds, teams that go into rebuilds and never come out of them. Everybody talks about blow up this team's horrible, this and that. And I have a reason to say, well, that's worth doing, right? But you also have to understand, especially for general managers, that's usually a death sentence, because usually the GM that starts that rebuild and puts the bulldozer into that building of whatever that team is never comes out the other side and never ends up seeing the finished product and never ends up being the GM that wins that Stanley Cup with that team if they ever get back there. And I think that's the sad reality of a situation that we're seeing across a lot of teams, and I think as good barometers in the Atlantic Division. I think what's interesting about the Atlantic is you have teams like the Detroit Red Wings, the Ottawa Senators, the Buffalo Sabres. I put those three teams in a very similar category. The Detroit Red Wings started the rebuild with Steve Yzerman, the Yzer plan, and all that stuff when he came in. The Ottawa Senators, they made a couple of trades a couple years ago, trading out Mark Stone, Erik Karlsson, and go down the list, right? Jean-Gabriel Pageau. They traded out a lot of their core players on that playoff run back from 2016. They end up making some moves, and they are still in that rebuild situation. Same thing for the Red Wings. And there's people saying that maybe Yzerman ends up getting the can at some point at the end of this year if they don't make the playoffs. Steve Yzerman, with all the success he had in Tampa, even Steve Yzerman is on the table for potentially losing his job. So how different are the Buffalo Sabres from that situation? Because I think for Buffalo Sabres fans, we have to look at this in a situation of timeline. The timeline for most of these teams when they started this version of a rebuild. And that's the problem for the Sabres. I think it's not the fact that they're in this rebuild. It's not the fact that they're comparing themselves to teams like the Senators and the Red Wings. It's the fact that it's been 20-something years. It's been basically 2 decades of just, we don't know what this team is. And I hate to say it, looking at the Buffalo Sabres today, it still feels like they don't have a culture or sort of something to rally behind. And I look at, and I know a lot of people don't like this example, but you look at the New York Islanders in 2020, 2021, 2022. They went to the Eastern Conference Finals 2 years in a row. That was a team that you knew what you were getting every night. They were tough to play against, defensive first mentality. They might only get 4 scoring opportunities a game, but they're going to score on those 3 or 4 opportunities. And they're just going to suck the life out of their opponent. And you knew that Barry Trotz and the Islanders were not going to give up a 2-goal lead in the third period. It was not going to happen. It didn't care if it was the best teams like the New York Rangers or teams like the Pittsburgh Penguins or the Washington Capitals or whoever it was. The Islanders had a 4-2 lead or a 2-0 lead or a 2-1 lead or a 1-0 lead. The Islanders going into the third period, I would sit there in the stadium knowing that the Islanders were going to win that hockey game no matter what. Have the Buffalo Sabres ever had any sort of culture like that? Or maybe the reverse. Even if it's a team that maybe doesn't have the most success in the postseason like the Toronto Maple Leafs, just the team up the road. Yeah, they haven't had a lot of playoff success, but at least they're making the playoffs. And they're always in the conversation for winning the division and the President's Trophy because at least, yeah, it's not the success in the playoffs, but at least they're having success. At least they're finding regular season success. And that's because of their scoring first mentality. We're going to score more goals than the other team, and we have all this star power down the middle, and we're going to find a way to win. Again, anything similar to that to the Buffalo Sabres? No. And I think that's part of why Sabres fans are so frustrated. What reason do Sabres fans have to believe right now? Now, they do have a world-class defenseman right now in Rasmus Dahlin. They have some good goaltending from guys like Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and Devin Levi. But when's the point where we're going to sit here and say that the Sabres are one of those 2 teams that I just mentioned, either the team up the road in Toronto or the team down south or east, the team east on Long Island? Are we ever going to talk about the Sabres in any sort of category of this is a tough team to play against? And love them or hate them, the Philadelphia Flyers are another team where they're in a rebuild, but it seems like they're in a more, you know where the direction of the ship is going. Because John Tortorella holds his players accountable, but on the flip side will also defend them if they don't get good officiating. When do we ever feel that with Lindy Ruff? Is there ever that sense of fieriness from Lindy Ruff? Ever that sense of, like, he's defending his players but also holding them accountable? It doesn't feel like that ever for the Sabres. And not just under Lindy Ruff, under any player or GM or head coach, there just seems to be such a lack of accountability. And this feeling of, we're going to let the wind take us wherever. There's no forcing their will. There's no forcing their will on the world or the league. And even though both these teams like the Flyers and the Sabres are in the same situation, 2 totally different mentalities of those teams. And that's what I want to talk about here. Because right now, the Buffalo Sabres are on a 7-game losing streak. Their last victory was November 23rd. There has been 7 games played since then. And what is that, 10? It's 11. So it has been 21 days at the making of this video. It's been 21 days since the Buffalo Sabres last won a hockey game. Plus, the issues with making the playoffs. So it's been, 17 years now? 17 or 18 years that the Buffalo Sabres have not made the playoffs. They're on a 7-game losing streak. In the beginning of December, they've basically disqualified themselves from the playoffs already at this point. And even though they're still technically in the running, does anybody really believe that the Buffalo Sabres are going to make the playoffs? Do they really think they're going to, even if the best case scenario, they jump teams like Detroit and Ottawa, which are in their similar division, same point totals. There's a lot more hope for those teams than the Sabres. And then you look at the teams ahead of them. Tampa's 4 points ahead. Boston's 7 points ahead. And Toronto's 8 points ahead. And the Panthers are 10 points ahead. Do we really see anywhere they're going to make up that ground easily against any of those teams ahead of them? Probably not. So for the Buffalo Sabres, then what comes next? Because Terry Pegula, as much as I love him for building the Penn State hockey team's arena, there is genuine issues with the Pagula situation because a lot of people will put a lot of this pressure on Terry Pagula and the lack of making some changes and holding his general manager accountable. Now, I know a lot of people will say Kevin Adams is kind of his sock puppet, and I don't like making accusations like that against GMs, but that's from what I've heard from people. I understand why that's there because the problem is it's the lack of accountability. It's the lack of accountability from Terry Pagula down to Kevin Adams, down to Lindy Ruff, down to the captain of the Buffalo Sabres. There's just a lack of that like tenacity. And when you're watching Buffalo Sabres games, it feels like that a lot of games. And it just seems like things go from bad to worse for this team. Tage Thompson being held out of the Four Nations championship situation. He might be the next greatest goal scorer right now in the National Hockey League. And that's saying a lot. But I really think when Tage Thompson is at his best, with players that can play with him, he is capable of being that level of player. We've seen it happen before. But it just seems like there's just such a lack of mismanagement of so many players on this team. And then the problem is Buffalo Sabres fans know the story. A guy like Tage Thompson will leave the Buffalo Sabres and he will go to a team, any team, and find success. And that is the damning and frustrating thing with this Buffalo Sabres team and all the Buffalo Sabres teams we've seen before this is they have so many players that when they're here, they don't play well. And they go somewhere else and they find success. Or they come here on a nice big contract like Jeff Skinner did a couple years ago and bombs. So it just seems like whenever you come to Buffalo, things don't go well. And then you either, before you got there, you play well, or after you leave, you play well. So you're not attracting free agents that way unless you're throwing good money at them. And the players that you're developing and are drafting aren't doing enough or have the talent around them to become their best version of themselves. And who does that fall on? That falls on ownership, management, and the coaching staff. And the lack of accountability is clear and evident for this team, as it always has been. Ever since I've been watching the Buffalo Sabres play at this point, which is really sad. I like to cheer for the Buffalo Sabres. I want reason to cheer for the Buffalo Sabres. I remember those runs. That was when I started really watching hockey. That 2006 to 2010 Buffalo Sabres, Drew Stafford, Jordan Leopold, Ryan Miller with the U.S. national teams, Danny Briere. That is when I fell in love with hockey. And as much as I watched the Islanders they weren't making the playoffs during that. They were drafting Josh Bailey and John Tavares during that time. I was watching the Buffalo Sabres going on playoff runs at that time. And they haven't been there since then. This is a Buffalo Sabres team that needs something to believe in. They have good players there, but you need somebody that's going to hold them up to a structure. And it's not just a sandcastle that blows in the wind and falls over. There needs to be more accountability from the top down. And you're seeing that evident with this team because you know what's going to ultimately happen? When the dollars stop coming in, when the attendance is low, that's when management and ownership has to make some changes. And we're seeing that right now. The fifth lowest attendance in the National Hockey League is the Buffalo Sabres. The same Buffalo area that has Bills Mafia in the NFL. You know what that area is capable of for their sports. It's a passionate, hardcore, dyed-in-the-wool for their team fan base. But if you give them nothing to believe in, the Buffalo Bills have given those fans something to believe in. But that same Bills Mafia can't be there for the Sabres because they know there is nothing there to believe in. Why am I going to invest big money in tickets, going to these games, spending $15 on a pretzel and a hot dog to watch a team that has been garbage for 2 decades? There's nothing to invest in there. There's no season ticket holders. There's nothing to believe in with this team right now. You have everything in front of you, but you need to give them what they need and a structure. John Tortorella would have been the perfect coach for the Buffalo Sabres. Fortunately, he's the coach of the Flyers. He fits that mold. He fits that culture. And for the Sabres, it just seems like they're just too willing to just sway in the wind like a palm tree, which is very far from Buffalo. And like I said, once again, the fifth lowest attendance in the National Hockey League. The only teams below them, Utah, San Jose, Winnipeg, and Anaheim. Those teams are always at the bottom. There's no reason the city of Buffalo, where they will show up if there's 2 or 3 feet of snow, they will shovel snow out of the stadium there in Buffalo. They're building a brand new stadium there for the Bills. You cannot tell me that there isn't a fan base there. That is alarming. There's something to be said for that. The Sabres need to figure it out. And I don't know if that's Terry Pegula completely stripping this team once again. But once again, it just seems like the same narrative. And they're going to strip it down again. They're going to get a new GM. They're going to get a new head coach. And we're going to be talking about, in 3 or 4 years, the next version of this rebuild. And can they finally reboot things again? I don't know what else to say. I'm at a loss for words for the Buffalo Sabres. I know the Sabres fans are frustrated out there. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. What do you guys think of the Buffalo Sabres, their situation? Because it doesn't look good right now. And I don't really see anything that's going to make it all that much better. I do like Rasmus Dahlin. I like Tage Thompson. I like the goalie situation. But time's ticking once again on the Buffalo Sabres. How much longer is it going to last? Let me know down below. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again next time.